Good evening, everyone, and welcome. Welcome to the book discussion, the panel featuring our very own Dean Rosa Solorio and her We are so excited to have this evening together. And I will start us off by introducing to you our Master of Ceremonies, and that would be Professor Ralph Steinhardt. You have in your program a version of his bio, I'll put it that way, because certainly it would be 4 or 5 pages if all of his accomplishments and accolades were to be written, but you get the flavor of it from the program. And so I commend that to you and want to just add something else. And that is that this gentleman and scholar has other bona fides that you might not be aware of. Approximately 20 years ago, it was none other than Professor Steinhardt who shepherded, proposed, and made real the Women's Studies program as a joint degree for our law students. Yes, that was Professor Steinhardt who did that and made that available for law school students to earn also a degree in women's studies. You can know from his background that he is passionate about the advancement of women, women's rights, and made that tangible here at our university. Not everyone knows that, but now you do. So, Professor Steinhardt, thank you.
Thank you, Renee. It is my happy privilege to welcome all of you to this panel discussion and this celebration of Rosa Solorio and her new book, Women and International Human Rights in Modern Times. Those of us who labor in the field of human rights often have to confront the fear, the possibility that our work is actually the triumph of hope over experience. But we also have learned to savor the successes, rare as those might be, a case that establishes accountability, an institution that lives up to its promise, a norm that starts out as an innovative idea and ripens into doctrine. Well, tonight we get to celebrate one of those successes as we celebrate Dean Solorio and her crucial and timely book. I'll be introducing Rosa and our distinguished panelists later, but first I want to thank Renee Devine for that introduction, even if it involved some history from the late Jurassic era. It was really her vision and her industry that made this celebration possible, made this panel a reality, and I thank you for that vision and that industry. I'd also like to acknowledge 2 guests in particular this evening, Dinah Shelton and Luis Jose Diaz-Canseco Nunez. Dinah Shelton, who I think is with us by Zoom, is the Manat An Professor of International Law Emerita at this law school and is known to many, if not all, in this room. A prolific and award-winning scholar, a beloved teacher on this faculty. She was the first woman nominated by the United States to the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, which she ultimately served as president. She also served as a legal consultant to the United Nations Environment Program, the United Nations Institute for Training and Research, the World Health Organization, the European Union, the Council of Europe, the Organization of American States, and it is a thrill to welcome her back to the law school, even remotely. Luis Jose Canseco Nunez is a named partner at Diaz-Canseco. He holds a master's degree. He's with us now. Very welcome here. A degree in comparative law, was a visiting scholar at this law school. Dean of the law school at the Technological University of Peru, currently a professor of law at Pontifical Catholic University of Peru, and with numerous high positions as consultant, as jurist, as president, and it's a thrill to welcome him back to the law school as well. Among the many happy privileges tonight is the privilege of introducing the Dean of the law school, who is, in my opinion, a truly visionary and strategic leader. Dr. Dana Bowen Matthew. Dr. Matthew is a nationally recognized lawyer and a legal scholar and public intellectual with three decades of industry and academic experience. An expert in health equity and public health policy, she has a passion for public service, which she brings to this faculty quite dramatically. She is also a prolific writer. In fact, our deans are not only leaders, which they are in spades, they also teach, they also write books. They understand this industry from the inside, and we were all made better by this group of deans that are at this law school. She is a prolific writer. She is the author of the best-selling book, Just Medicine, A Cure for Racial Inequality in American Healthcare, and the newly released book to great acclaim, Just Health, Treating Structural Racism to Heal America. With that, I invite Dean Matthew to come to the podium and offer a few words of her own.
Thank you so much. I will say that I often try to signal, as I did, to no avail. Please make it short. Just say my name and let me come up. And people think it's humility, and it's really not humility. It's that part where they say 3 decades of, and I'm like, but I've barely been here 3 decades. So I really don't want to be accounted for as 3 decades old. I want to say this is an amazing event. Congratulations to you, Dean Solario. I could stop there because I will mess up if I pause too long. Good afternoon, as you've heard, I'm Dana Bowen Matthew. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. I'm Dean of the Law School, as you've already heard, but what you haven't heard is how thrilled, how absolutely proud I am to welcome you to this event on this important discussion of women and international human rights. Thank you for joining us, and you are in for a treat this afternoon. I saw someone on the way up the stairs and they said, "How are you?" And I said, if it's possible to be in duality, both ecstatic at one time and heavy-hearted at another, I'm both of those things right now, because as looking at this book has made me do, I was looking through it in preparation for my comments. I said, I saw a photograph. It was taken, as many of you saw, by Mikhail Palenchuk last Sunday, of women's bodies laying in the streets of Ukraine. And the story was about the threat of rape and the use of rape as a weapon of war. And in thinking about that picture, I cannot help but think that what we're doing here is more than celebrating a book and more than talking about a topic. We hopefully are equipping ourselves to combat the kind of crimes, the kind of assaults on humanity that we are watching occur yet again in our world. This book is something to be congratulated as a scholar. Dean Solario has been teaching international human rights at GW Law School for 12 years. It grows out of that extreme deep experience of helping to equip and direct students. It reflects not only her work in the classroom, but also her wealth of experience litigating cases in the field for the past 20 years. She's worked with key entities that advance women's rights globally and regionally, including a number of United Nations agencies, organizations, and the International Rights Commission of the Organization of American States. It's a challenge to publish a book under the best of circumstances. And these past 2 years have been anything but the best of circumstances. We've been teaching remotely, and she has done that. We've been advising students remotely, serving as a program director. She has done that. She's been parenting with her husband. She's been a partner. And all of this while writing a subject that has weighed on my heart for the past 3 days. This book is not a case book. I know that it's titled a contemporary case book, but I have been teaching at least for those 3 decades that my colleague talked about, and I've never seen a case book quite like this. This is a work of scholarship. It's a work curated in order to bring forth not only important issues, but perspectives on those issues. It's a book that is intended to inspire new thinking, influence action, and impact the world. And that makes it the best of what GW Law has to offer. I'm proud to call you my colleague. I'm proud that you have done this as one of the crowning achievements of your career, and I'm proud that we get to benefit from it. I joined Dean Solario in her hope expressed to me that the book awakens a passion in its readers, that it advances human dignity, that it contributes to the betterment of societies and guides them to equality, inclusion, diversity, and justice. Today, you'll have the privilege of hearing from the panel before you. I don't think it's my job to fully introduce them, but I just want to say also thank you to my colleagues, Ralph Steinhardt, the Lobinger Professor of Comparative Law and Jurisprudence. Professor Steinhardt is joined by Ed Swain, the Charles Kennedy Poe Research Professor, Karen Brown, the Theodore Reinhardt Professor of Business Law, and Dr. Mary Ellsberg, the Executive Director of the GW Global Women's Institute. And the reason I'm sure it's not my job, because if that's your introduction, you guys got off way better than I did. I hope they tell you more about their accomplishments. I extend my sincere thanks to each of our panelists. I extend my sincere welcome to each of you here, and I extend my heartfelt congratulations to you, Dean Solario. Welcome.
So the plan for this panel is to have Rosa say a few words about the book, the process that led to the publication of this book, her own thought process that went into this. And then I will invite each of the three panelists to take 5 minutes or so, 5 to 7 minutes or so, offering their reflections on the book, or perhaps engaging in a conversation with Dean Solorio. And then I want to make sure that we leave enough time for you in the audience to ask your own questions or make your own reflections about the timeliness of this book. And so in order not to spend too much time on the preliminaries, let's get down into the show itself. And let me turn to Dean Solorio for her initial reflections on how this book came to be a reality.
Thank you so much, Professor Steinhardt, and thank you all for being here. This is an incredible honor for me. This is incredibly humbling. One thing that I can tell you is that I never expected, this, when I started writing this book, I just wanted a casebook for my class, and we'll talk a little bit about that. And I'm just incredibly honored by your friendship and your generosity. And there's so many of you in the room that I've learned from over the years. So I just want to start by saying that for me, this is so significant because a lot of the leaders in this field are here, right? And a lot of people that have followed their work over the years, like Ralph, for example, and the panelists here, Dr. Ellsberg and Karen Brown and Ed Swain. And I'm just incredibly honored to be sharing this space with you. I also want to thank Dean Matthew. I know she had to step out, but she will come back for those wonderful and kind words. And in terms of the book, one thing that I can tell you, is that when you work on a book like that, there's a process involved, right? And it's a process that you undertake on your own, but there's also a circle of people that are around you. So I want to also thank my family profusely. I want to start by saying that my husband's here, my sister's connected, my mom is connected online. The reality is that I had an incredible amount of love and support, to be able to produce work like this, especially in the middle of a pandemic. And I also want to thank so much my colleagues at GW Law School. There's a number of deans and administrators here, that have supported me at every point in the process of my career at GW Law School. In particular, I want to mention Dean Menedevina, who came up with this event and really was the heart of organizing all of this. And this is such a beautiful moment, and it reflects your generosity and all of your contributions to the law school, and also your mentorship of me over the years. I want to thank the administrators. I want to thank this amazing faculty that I have, and I also want to thank the women that have taught me so much over the years. There's a lot about the book That's theory, that's judgments, that's case decisions, that's views related to, international human rights of women that have been adopted, not only at the United Nations level, but also at the regional level. But there's also a lot of heart. I was trying to also reflect, the suffering, what women go through, the path, the challenges, when you are fighting for your human rights. And there's actually a lot of activists in the room. I want to mention, that there's a number of them here. I've been so privileged and honored to work with all of them over the years, and also survivors, and I think there's a lot in the book that reflects their views as well. In terms of the book itself, a lot of the book is presenting what the contemporary standards are, or what we call the global and regional standards are related to the international human rights of women. So you will see a lot of case decisions, a lot of views, a lot of statements, not only from United Nations entities, but also regional systems and treaties and instruments related to this area. But one thing that was very important for me as well, and this was part of my reflection, was to connect all of that with modern issues. I have a lot of curiosity when it comes to women's rights issues. I've been very honored and privileged to be able to work in the area for 20 years. So I wanted to explore, what does it mean to have, when we talk about discrimination and gender-based violence, which are really well-known subjects for us at this moment. It's something that we talk about in international law all the time, but how is this connected to COVID-19? How is this connected to the Me Too movement? How is this connected to the digital space, to environment and climate change, to the evolving nature of LGBTI issues and other modern issues? For me, it was very important to look at not only the classical, but also how the classical connects with what we're seeing on a day-to-day basis when it comes to contemporary issues. The book in many ways is for students. I really thought of my students when I was writing it. For me, it's incredible that a lot of my students are in the room. I did this book for you in many ways, and it's been my honor to be in the classroom with many of you for 12 years. And it's incredible that many of you are in the women's rights field, that after you actually took that class, you actually undertook careers in this area. I've learned from you. And I always tell my students, that I hope that my classes are not only about doctrine and theory, but that they also get inspired, that they get mobilized, that they want to work in the area of women's rights and address these issues as well. And the book is also for academics. It's also for practitioners. One thing that has been incredible in this process, because they needed training material. It's not something necessarily that I had in mind, but I'm so delighted to hear this, that the book can serve as a way to train practitioners in the area as well. And I also hope that it's an important tool for survivors as well. It's very important to equip survivors, to empower women, to give them leadership, to advance autonomy. And I do hope that the book also serves that purpose as well. I want to thank you all so much for being here. I have no words. I mean, for me, this is beyond what I expected. I'm not even used to this kind of attention. So if you see me looking down, etc., it's like, everybody's looking at me. Oh my God. I'm not used to this, but I'm so grateful, that all of you are here, celebrating what for me was such an important process, and something that I will always treasure, this book. Thank you so much.
Some things are dreamy and improved because you don't wake up. So in this case, this is actually happening, but it is not, this is your life. We're not going to bring out people from your past, but we will bring out people from your present. It is a great honor to have some of the leading thought leaders on this faculty, and not just the law faculty, but also across this university. The full biographical sketches are on the flyer for the program, and I urge you to read it. But I, like the dean, I'm a little concerned that if I really did introduce these people as they deserve, we'd be here until our time ran out, and that's not my idea of a good time. But what I thought I would do is turn to the panelists in alphabetical order and invite them to offer a few words, some observations about the book, or perhaps to ask some questions of Rosa as they are led, as the Quakers say. So first up is my colleague Karen Brown, the Theodore Reinhardt Professor of Business Law at GW Law School and a longtime colleague of my own. and invite her to offer her initial thoughts.
Thank you, Professor Stein. Do I press
I
this
think you're
or
all set.
we don't need to?
So long as it's green, it's
Okay.
clean.
Okay, perfect. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. I am so proud of my colleague, Dean Solorio. We've worked very closely together in many of her events and activities here at the law school, and she is just a marvel and amazing. And I still can't even figure out how she got everything done. I told her she is a superwoman running a program, teaching and writing a book, and having a family life. I am amazed and in awe. And she's just the best of the best, not just professionally accomplished, but also just a wonderful, beautiful person. And so it's a really pleasure to be here. And I did want to make a few remarks, not really questions, but an observation. First of all, the book is amazingly rich and full. I learned so much from going through the book, and I haven't even finished reading all of it. But I did go through, and as Dean Solorio was just saying, the addition of those last three words, in modern times, women and international human rights in modern times, I was actually taken by it, because she really does cover some important issues, like the impact on women during COVID and the Me Too movement, et cetera. And I was like, wow, this is like she just wrote the book yesterday, because it covers so many of the important current events that I had not considered. You always know that there are impacts on women and other marginalized groups in society. And so she really just brought that to, real full attention for me, that yes, this had to have had a huge impact on women, COVID, Me Too, et cetera, and just all the things that women face in general in society. She really, brought that home to me, and the resources are phenomenal. I'm thinking, how could I teach a course, bring tax in it somehow and teach a course on this? So I'm trying. There's a lot of important material here that's just important for me to know. But it's, I think, making an important contribution to the literature. I was looking at the portion about economic and social rights, and partly, near and dear to my heart, because I do teach taxation. And actually was on a panel with Dr. Ellsberg a few years ago here at GW, where we kind of talked about the UN had done a study on basically how law impacts women, and one of the aspects was tax law. And so we each had a part on the panel where we sort of talked about that. And I was thinking, as I was reading Rosa's book, that there is an impact. That is, that she gives us a compendium of, as she was just saying, conventions, treaties, other resources that give us a rich exploration of the authorities for human rights for women as a goal, as a guiding principle, et cetera. And then I was then looking at the sort of the disconnect between all these lofty principles, and then how are they actually being carried out, on the ground. And so, I was thinking about, for example, the United States, which is my best case study, where we have, as I think I'm not wrong about this, we have not signed the Convention on Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. Oh, we have not ratified. Okay, we have not ratified that convention, which is kind of unbelievable. And then I learned from Rosa that there is an American convention that has explores some similar issues. And then I think about how that has not permeated our domestic law. When I think about teaching tax, actually tomorrow we're going to talk about taxpayer status and the fact that women are in particular disadvantaged by the tax law, and that there are still now forces in our own tax law that basically work to keep women at home still. The assumption is that the woman would be the second earner, and it doesn't make any sense for her to go out into the workplace because she will be married to someone who'll be earning a lot of money, typically a man, and who it doesn't suffer wage discrimination, and that we still haven't learned anything from our principles, you know, and our ideals and our goals. I talked to my students about pay equity, pay parity, and I was just looking up and thinking about my remarks here that there still is a day where women, in France, I think they walk out of work. We don't do that here, but there is a day, I think it's a day in March, where women are finally have worked enough to make as much money as men did last year. And so, and we still are, we're not doing anything. We have these ideals and principles, but we're not doing anything in current domestic law to change those things. And all those things operate in the tax law and the lack of pay parity, et cetera, operate to continue economic discrimination against women. And so that was I think one of my takeaways from the book, which is that, yes, if only we could, you know, incorporate really be true to these ideals. Rosa knows also I've been working with the World Bank on a project that looks trying to incorporate sustainability goals, one of which is actually gender equity into basically business law types of areas, and one would be tax law. And so we've been working on a project to do that. And it's an important project, you know, sponsored by the World Bank. I just have a little bit of worry and concern that it's not going to actually be implemented, although we have these goals and ideals and we know what we should be doing, and somehow it doesn't get down to the ground where we actually have implemented it into the domestic law. So those are my observations, Rosa. Thank you so much for giving me so much food for thought. And I have a lot to think about in terms of my own work. Thank you so much.
Professor Brown. It's a great privilege to welcome Dr. Mary Ellsberg to this panel. Dr. Ellsberg is the executive director of the GW Global Women's Institute. The bio is available to you, but Dr. Ellsberg has a deep and demonstrated commitment to global gender issues over decades and around the world, but with I think it's fair to say, a special expertise in the Americas. So, Dr. Ellsberg, it is fantastic to welcome you to the law school.
Thank you so much. And I'm really honored to be here and a little anxious because I think I may be one of the few non-lawyers in the room. So.
That's the beauty of it.
And I think I do count as one of the people who can say that this is your life, Rosa, because I met Rosa over 20 years ago when she was like, you were like a junior professional officer or something at UN Women. She was, when I say I've known her since she was a baby. And she, you know, it was clear that she was a rock star from that moment. And then all the years that she spent at the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, and has been such an amazing ally to women's movements. So many times when we were organizing hearings around femicide or other issues, Rosa was right there to help prepare people and discuss the issues. So I'm a huge fan of Rosa, and still there are many of the projects that we're doing. I work on violence against women and mostly research, but we do look a lot at women's access to justice, particularly in conflict and humanitarian settings. And so Rosa's advised us in many of our studies about how to apply human rights instruments to the work that we're doing. So delighted to be here. As I was reading the book, I could not believe, and I was saying to Rosa in the elevator, it's like, surely this book already existed. How is it possible that we haven't had a book like that? And I know it doesn't actually, because, you know, I don't have access to law libraries, but every time I've ever referred to anything around human rights, I've had to go directly to the UN papers or the Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women. And most of us who work in this field, we're trying to pull it all together. It doesn't always, they don't all speak to each other. And so to have somebody who have the opportunity to have it all there, laid out, explaining the history of it all and how concepts and terms have changed is incredibly valuable, not just for lawyers and law students, but for all of us. And others have mentioned this already, but I was just also astonished at, how incredibly, hot off the presses, some of these issues are. And just some of them just so timely, and we needed this analysis, looking at things with much more of an intersectional lens. I really appreciate that you brought that into it. Again, Me Too, COVID, and then some of these, for example, like the online violence, new forms of violence, and having literally off the press the special rapporteur on violence against women's report on online violence, which is incredibly important. That just came out like last year. So very, very useful. And I really like the questions at the end, the thoughtful questions. I think these are questions that are not just for lawyers, but do we need another convention on violence against women, or should we continue to just use, CEDAW, for example? Those are very important right now to the women's movement globally. We're all talking about these issues, even the definitions of gender-based violence. And then the piece that I'll say a few more words about, if I may, is how much you center also social movements and the impact of the women's movement on both creating this whole body of instruments and standards, but also how important they are to the women's movement. And I actually learned about human rights not as a researcher, but as an activist. It says somewhere in my bio that I spent 20 years in Nicaragua. I'm still very connected to the women's movement there. And this will completely date me, but I was in Beijing in 1995 at that conference, and was part of the women's movement in Nicaragua when we were sending reports to Vienna, to the Women's Tribunal, and to the Human Rights Summit when women's rights are human rights was that tagline first came out. And that was so incredibly important for us. The idea to have it ratified at a global level, the idea that states are responsible for what happens to you in home, that if you are being beaten or raped by somebody in your home, that's always been seen as a private problem, and it just basically, sucks for you. But you couldn't use international human rights for that. And during this period of the 90s, with Beijing, with Cairo, with Vienna, that whole paradigm blew open. And suddenly states are responsible. You can sue states for not doing what they're supposed to do and uphold those standards. So for the women's movement, our very first act around that period was to get the government. We had a big national campaign with women, from countryside, from all over, to get Nicaragua to ratify the Belén do Pará Declaration, which was incredibly important. So that was 1995, I guess. And then as soon as it was ratified, to start working on our own laws on violence against women. And because we'd ratified, and we were all learning from the lawyers and from CLADEM, the international feminist lawyers, that international law supersedes the national law, we realized that we could use these tools very effectively to say, okay, now we need to have a law, and this is what should go into the law. And within a year, we actually did get that law. So I have many, many stories, which I won't tell you, but of how incredibly crucial human rights instruments are for the women's movement. And I think it's worth saying, because I think in the United States, we don't tend to talk very much about international standards and human rights, or we don't think of that as something that affects our daily lives. But in the global South, in Nicaragua, for a woman in a very rural community to hear that she has human rights, she has rights not to be beaten, she has rights over her body that are hers just because she's a human being, that is actually incredibly profound and incredibly meaningful, and really the backbone of what propels the passion of women. The most recent example, and just seeing Shelby Quast here, who is leading with Rosa the case before the Inter-American Human Rights Court of Brisa de Angulo, which is who is suing the Bolivian government for not having upheld her rights and given her justice for her sexual assault 20 years ago. So we have some real rock stars and people who are my heroes right now for doing that work. But again, it's completely based on these standards. And they're going to make a difference, not just in the life of Brisa, but of girls throughout all Latin America, and probably even beyond, because so many people pay attention to what the Inter-American Court is doing. So just the last thing I'll say is we now are finally getting a national action plan in the United States. And I've also realized I don't have very much experience domestically, but now talking to my colleagues from the women's movement and lawyers who are working and in the White House working on this national action plan, we're realizing that what we really have to offer are the experiences of the global South and knowledge of international human rights. And one of the big principles that you don't see very often in US policy is that it has to be based in international human rights. And that is the main principle. And that's coming from this international pressure and global experience. It's not coming from within. And then the last piece is just to say that, of course, all of this is incredibly important, but it's not enough. And that's where the work that I do and that the women human rights defenders do is making sure that we're applying these standards everywhere, and that, and creating the whole environment in which the laws and the standards are actually being implemented and enforced, which they so often are not. So thank you very much, Rose, and thank you for having me here.
Thank you, Dr. Ellsberg. Next up, we have my colleague Ed Swain, who is the Charles Kennedy Poe Research Professor of Law. Ed, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ralph. A few words, lest they be neglected, in praise of the book itself and also of Dean Solorio. I don't know if you know this from your interactions with her personally, but her approach is, and I don't mean this as an accusation, fundamentally deceptive. In that she practices analytically, I think, a style of martial arts in which she allows others in the room to speak and then uses their momentum against them, and usually with a disarming question or two. And one of the, I think, signal virtues of the book, which has already been mentioned, is its very adroit use of questions. She will reproduce CEDAW general comment or a provision of a regional human rights instrument, and then simply ask a series of penetrating questions about it, which I think is extremely useful as a teaching technique and very helpful for me as somebody who had read much of the primary material before. So kudos to you. I think it is expertly done. A couple of quick observations about the topic, just as a spur maybe for further discussions during Q&A about the international human rights of women, in particular, probably in relation to gender-based violence against women. Two observations, I guess. One is these rights are, I think, distinctively searching. As mentioned earlier, they attack the supposition, which had been too widespread before, that public offenses against human rights are one thing and private offenses are a completely different sort of sacrosanct preserve in which many of the same abuses can be practiced by individuals, including within the family, against one another. And because the rights of women are often violated in the home, international human rights law takes on the bold step of crossing that threshold and takes on, I think, quite a difficult task that is not, I think it's just a degree of difficulty greater than most other international human rights causes. The second related point is that international human rights for women are sorely needed given the pervasiveness and scale of the abuses. I was thinking before this panel, if I could think of another widely subscribed multilateral treaty beyond even human rights treaties that really address such a difference between aspirations and the reality on the ground. And it's hard to come up with examples of one that are so progressive and so ambitious in what they are undertaking. These observations, I think, create kind of the problem that she grapples with so masterfully in the book, again, indirectly, largely through penetrating questions. One is how can we urgently establish these urgently needed rights, especially on a universal basis? Obviously, the leading candidate is CEDAW. As she indicates in the book, this has a number of obvious challenges to it, including the scale of reservations by states, including attacks on the CEDAW committee and the like. Customary international law is sometimes advocated, including by the CEDAW committee, but again, we have to confront there the issue of state practice, which is not one-sided, or at least it's not wholly progressive in its character. We have states that have only in the 1970s in Europe and within the last decade elsewhere, given women the right to vote. In light of challenges like that, it's unsurprising that some of the more ambitious objectives haven't been fulfilled. And the related question is whether the scale of these abuses disabuse us of the idea that these are rights and that rights talk is itself helpful. I think the answer, which I have found convincing myself, lies in the word that was used earlier, mobilization. I think it is very difficult to pin too many hopes on rights enforceable as such in this space. I don't think we're there yet, but I think that they have been extremely helpful in as catalysts for political movements within society. And so I think that the style of the book lends itself very well to that. By not treating this as a pat area, by asking questions, by teaching, I think that this book can be extraordinarily effective and an ally to this cause. So with that, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thanks. As I think about all three of the contributions that have been made over the last half hour or so, it reminds me of something that I try to teach my own human rights students. And that is that we labor in a vineyard that produces a grape every other year. Whether it is the disconnect between the international and the domestic realm that Professor Brown was talking about, or the tremendous amount of work that remains to be done around the world and the power of law politically, as Dr. Ellsberg was suggesting, or the continuing challenges that lie ahead when we are empowered by a convention that addresses discrimination, but discrimination only, which takes maleness as the norm and which therefore misses a huge range of the varieties of ways that women's rights might be violated. So we do labor in a vineyard that produces a grape every other year. But what I tell my students is human rights advocates have to learn to savor the grape. That one grape they will savor. And that's very useful. It's useful because it avoids burnout. It avoids the secondary trauma that comes from working in this area. It helps us contextualize the kind of constant brutality that we see in front of us and the failure of the law actually to prevent it. But I also tell my students that no law can prevent its own violation. That contract law does not prevent breaches of contract. It sets up consequences when there's a breach of contract. The criminal law doesn't stop crimes. It sets up consequences. It tries to guide conduct. But we don't assume that criminal law doesn't exist because homicides occur. So too, it seems to me that international law, like law generally, guides conduct. And that the important thing is not so much that it can't prevent its own violation, which it cannot do, but whether it sets up meaningful incentives to do the right thing, that it is internalized in some meaningful way, and that those who violate it are held to account. All of that is a long wind-up for a pitch. And that is, what is your grape? What grape do you savor in this book?
That's such a great question, Brad. Professor Steinhardt is the only person in the world that can ask that question. For me, in my 20-year career with women's rights issues, it has been the resilience of the survivors. There's nothing like it. I'll give you an example. I was very, very honored to be advising in the case that Dr. Ellsberg just mentioned, the case of Brisa de Angulo, that some of the activists are here. I see Shada Vance, I see Shelby Quest, I see Barbara Jimenez. You know, this case was just litigated before the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. And I actually met Brisa de Angulo when I worked at the Human Rights Commission. She was so much younger. And I remember her story. It's just absolutely harrowing. But then you have this woman that takes this story, becomes a lawyer, becomes a CNN hero. She becomes this major global figure because she wants to make sure that no other person under 18 years old goes through sexual violence the way she went through. This is her life's work. And just seeing her in action in this hearing for me was just absolutely so moving. You know, the way she spoke to the court, the way she made demands to the court with the eloquence that she talks about what she went through, it kind of like in many ways brought alive all the international law, you know, that's discussed in the book. I had moments in which I was like, I just can't believe she's speaking to the court with such grace, considering the atrocities that she has gone through. So for me, that has always been a big grape, you know. The other big grape, you know, is that I love working with students. One of the reasons why I feel incredibly grateful, you know, for the opportunity, actually Rap was the chair of my selection committee, just so that you know. And Karen Brown was in my selection committee too. There's a few people here that are responsible for me being here in many ways, you know. I love working with students, you know, and I love going into that classroom and asking all the questions that Professor Swain mentioned. You know, a lot of the questions that are in the book are questions that I ask my students in the class. I love the discussions in the class. I love the fact that I have an opportunity to impact the next generation, you know, and I feel that we all have a responsibility towards that. You know, when you're working, especially in a field like international law and human rights, you know, a lot of our classroom is about doctrine, but it's also about motivating that this work continues. And for me, instilling certain values also in the way that the law is looked at is very important. Like I always tell my students, you know, it's very important to be compassionate when you read the law. Very important. You know, sometimes that's more important, you know, than the actual theoretical prowess that you could bring to the interpretation of a specific treaty. That compassion is important. You know, think about inclusion, think about human rights, think about justice, all the things that we want to advance in the world. And you can advance that in any field that you work at. I'll give you an example. Shada Vance, she works at Hugh Hubbard, right? The team that defended Brisa de Angulo is a team in a law firm. And I have to say, I was so incredibly impressed with Shada and all of the attorneys of Hugh Hubbard, with the humanity, you know, with the way that they so clearly articulated their arguments, but also looked at the law compassionately. Out of that, you know, after they leave a class, and I always tell students too, it's very important that you use the law to make people, you know, hopeful, to make people feel better. Like for me, a big goal in life is anybody who comes in my office or anybody that comes into my classroom needs to leave feeling better. If they don't feel better, there's a problem. I did something wrong, you know, and I'm sure that I have done something wrong, you know, many times, but I really want, you know, they're paying so much money to have this education, you know, I want them to leave with something that they feel can be a tool for the future. So for me, that's a big grape too, you know, when it comes to human rights work. And lastly, there are some successes. You know, I always tell students, you know, the reality is that, like Ralph said, completely accurate. Like, you know, when you're working on human rights, you have a grape every 2 or 3 years, right? You know, it's a realm where you won't always have success, but sometimes you do have success. You know, sometimes you do get that amazing judgment. Sometimes you do get that amazing piece of legislation that you have been fighting for. Sometimes, you know, the reality is, as Dr. Ellsberg said, we have a lot of the international standards, the global and regional standards that we have in women's rights. This is a success for the women's rights movement. These are hard fought, but we have them. And we have these laws. And even though, of course, many of us dedicate ourselves to saying, you know, they could be better, and we have them, right? So I do think that what Professor Steinhardt just said is very wise. You know, it's very important to also focus on what's good, right? Not just what's bad, even though we will always focus on what's bad because we want to address it, but I think it's important to also focus on what's good. And I do think that there's a lot happening in women's rights that's also good, aside from the challenges. And we know that the challenges are quite large, right? And we're trying to address them as well.
Thank you for that. It reminds me, before we open it up to questions from the floor, it reminds me of a client that I represented in the first trial under the Alien Tort Statute, which is an ancient statute that allows aliens to sue if they are the victims of a tort, a civil wrong in violation of the law of nations or a treaty of the United States. And the first trial was against Ferdinand Marcos, the former president of the Philippines. And we got a multi-million-dollar judgment. And when I mentioned to one of the clients, a woman who had suffered horrendous abuse at the direction of Ferdinand Marcos, I said, you know, there's a chance that you won't see a dime of this because the Philippine government was in line and the Marcos family itself was doing a lot to hide their assets. And so it was great, you know, yay, you got a big number on a piece of paper. And I said, there's a very good chance you won't see one thin dime, I think was the phrase, not one thin dime of this judgment. And she said something I haven't forgotten in over 35 years. And that is, that's okay, it's enough to be believed. It's enough to be believed that she had been told for such a long time that her torturer was her boyfriend, for example. That's where the grape lies. So I thank you for really focusing us in on who matters in this job. Let me open it up to questions from the floor. We have a few minutes remaining. I'll take your lead. Okay. Any questions, observations? Please. And please identify yourself into the microphone.
Hi, Alberto Benitez. Felicidades, Dean Celorio. You've shared in other forums that you are the daughter of an immigrant. So I'd like to know if you could share with us, being the daughter of an immigrant, how did it influence your book? Thank you.
Well, first of all, thank you so much to Professor Benitez, he's a mentor, he's a friend, he's a supporter. I've learned so much from him working at GW. He's one of my favorite people in the world. So I just want to start by saying
Yeah,
that.
get in line.
I mean, the reality is that I think that that's probably one of the most important things that has always shaped me. You know, I'm the daughter of a Cuban immigrant, and I kind of grew up with all of these immigration stories and all of these refugee stories and all of these stories of the suffering, you know, the trajectory of a person that has to leave their homeland to a completely different homeland, right? You know, and all of the negative experiences that come with that, you know, but also the resilience that comes with that, you know. And I come from a home where, since I was very small, basically the MO in my house, and I think my mom is watching, was you have to be resilient. You have to be resilient. You know, the fact that there's adversity in life doesn't mean that you don't address that adversity, you know. And the other MO in my house was you have to be kind to people. You have to be empathetic. You have to stand in other people's shoes, you know. And the fact that there's a person that, you know, has a different education for you or comes from a different economic class, that doesn't mean that you get to treat them poorly. You have to treat everybody the same. And the other thing that my dad always taught me, you know, was, he passed away almost a decade ago, was, you know, you're very lucky, Rosa. I remember I grew up, you know, my dad was like, you're very lucky, you know, you haven't had, you know, the refugee experience or the immigration experience, but this means that since you're so lucky, you have to use that to help others. And I want to make sure that whoever comes across your path, you remember me, you know, you remember me, your dad who was the refugee and the immigrant, you know. And I think in many ways that led me in many ways to an international law career, to a human rights career. The reality is that since I was very little, I knew there were other countries, you know, like for me, I was always very international minded. I was always trying to pay attention to what was happening outside of Puerto Rico. And I think that really helped, you know, shape my mindset, you know. And it's interesting because my dad passed away a decade ago, and I still think so much about him. You know, when I was like writing this book, you know, I was like, you know, every word, every sentence, I was like, I really want to make him proud. I want him to feel that I'm producing work, that helps people. And I want him to be, to say this was worth it. It was worth it to be an immigrant, to be a refugee, to give these opportunities to my daughter that he didn't have, so he's very big in the acknowledgements, because he really shaped everything in many ways, and my mother as well. My mom is connected, and I have to say, like, everything that I am, everything that I have accomplished, the reality is that I have an incredible mom, and my mom also went through a lot of hardship when she was growing up. She didn't come from a high income family. She had to be resilient. She was the first person to go to college, from her family, and all she's done in her life is work very hard, and be supportive to her family and children. And also she's so kind, and I think that that's something that for me, I have the deepest admiration for. She's always kind, even in moments where something infuriating happens to her. She's such a nice person. I really try to emulate that. For me, that's really, really, really important. So I really salute my parents today. And I think that, I hope they're proud when they see a book like this, because for me, like, they've given me so much that it's just, in many ways, I really credit them for many things.
Thank you. Other questions from the floor? Please.
My name is Shelby Shelby Quast. I'm a human rights lawyer. And one of the, Professor Steinhardt, you said something that I might have a longer discussion with you about. And that's the use of the law as a tool for prevention. I'm curious how you all might address that. How can the law be used not only for prosecution, even criminal laws, but how can they be used to have those conversations that we wouldn't otherwise have, that people can see what rights they might have? And it actually brings it to a value question of how your country values you or the state values. So I was curious if you could talk about the other, maybe the laws as an accelerator for social change.
I think it all starts with the law, and I first want to recognize Shelby Quast. Shelby Quast is a legendary women's rights activist. And I've actually had the privilege of working with her for a number of years. So I really welcome this question, And I think that when you think of international law, when you think of human rights in general, in many ways, the laws are the symbol. They're the symbols that we're taking these issues seriously, that we have a structure in the state, to be able to address these issues. It really starts with the law. And I would say at the constitutional level, in many ways, it's just that unfortunately, we don't always have that constitutional recognition. So sometimes we do have to start with basic legislation. But I think part of the problem that we have is that, as you know, in many countries, they have adopted these beautiful laws, right? But they just don't get applied. They don't get implemented, right? So now a lot of the discourse is, please adopt the law, but we do need to apply it correctly. I mean, we have regions like the Americas that have had 3 waves of legislation related to gender-based violence. 3 waves, which is incredible, right? From countries that transitioned from repressive regimes and dictatorships not so long ago, and we already have 3 waves of legislation. We have our own convention, on violence against women. And you have this incredible legislative framework, but then when it comes to the application, that's really where we have this big gap. But I do think having those laws in place is a huge signal. It's a huge signal that a problem will not be tolerated socially, that a state is ready and prepared, that there will be a sanction, if this act occurs. And this is very important when it comes to gender-based violence. A lot of gender-based violence occurs because there's this perception that it's going to be tolerated, that is not going to be sanctioned. But unfortunately, we are at a stage where we really have to connect the dots with the application, because it's easy to adopt laws, and that's part of the big problem that we have today. And I think we need to monitor laws better too. I mean, I think part of the problem that we have also is that, for example, in the Americas, we have all these femicide laws, right? But they're not necessarily monitored, right? We need to monitor more closely what's effective, what doesn't work, and resources need to be invested in that, right? So we need to keep on pushing, states to devote resources to all of this, But I do think it starts with the laws in many ways,
please.
Hi. Hi, I'm Barbara Jimenez from Equality Now, also a lawyer. I just want to say thank you, Rosa. I think I'm with Mary that I thought when you told me I'm writing a book about human, I'm like, why are you doing that? That's already done. And then I went back, I mean, like, no, that's true. We're being like collecting and working our own little memos and our own little books. And the way that you've done this is beautiful. I even love the cover, the colors is so well thought. And also very structured in a way that is very easy to understand for us that we use these, materials every day, but also for people that doesn't understand or doesn't see the value on these instruments, right? And all the advanced or the good things that are happening or you can use with international standards. I see with this book is hope. Because we're seeing many new ways or new generations that are losing that hope of why this international law is so important for women's rights. And the way that is structured and the question that is asking us all the time also give us, for me, for my work, is this, okay, this is the next topic that we're gonna start working. Rosa Celorio's already put it on there in the agenda. Let's just discuss it. So thank you very much. For me, Rosa she's a mentor, but it's this type of mentor that you can sit and talk and discuss and learn and exchange conversations and thoughts. And thank you very much for the book.
Thank you, Barbara. And I have to say something about Barbara Jimenez. She's from that glorious island. There's this glorious island, that it's very important to mention. She's from Puerto Rico, as me, right? And I have to say what an absolute joy it has been to collaborate with Barbara over the years. And I have to say, I really thank you also, Barbara, and all the activists in the room, because even though I'm in academia, you keep on inviting me to advise and to collaborate and to work with you. And it's a joy. It's really is fantastic to be able to do it from this side, and to be able to kind of have a window to the amazing work that you do, and how hard you work. You work so hard, and I think when you work that hard, you have to be hopeful in some way. So I'm glad that you are still hopeful, because you need to continue doing what you're doing.
One last question.
Hi, I'm Alison Anthony. I'm a visiting scholar here at GW from South Africa. I actually wanted to note the beautiful cover as well. So I wanted to ask, was there an idea behind that? Does it represent anything? Even if it doesn't, it's gorgeous, it's beautiful. I am a researcher in government procurement law. And last year, I did a project with a colleague of mine about women-owned businesses and the extent to which they are either benefited or disadvantaged in supply chain in South Africa. So I know that it's not your area and that you do very general or international women's rights, but I wanted to know whether in your readings or cases there you have come across any women's issues in contracting relationships specifically, either on an international level or private sector, public sector. Are there any specific, because in the South African instance, we interviewed a lot of women in women-owned businesses and found that there were quite a number of issues which prevented women to have access to government contracting.
Alison, thank you so much for your question. And actually, as a matter of fact, you have an emerging line of scholarship, that's actually developing, that is so interesting, connecting government procurement issues with also women's rights issues. And a lot of this line of scholarship is connected also to business and human rights, and the reality is that we have all these incredible developments when it comes to business and human rights, and now we're starting to also look at those with a gender lens, You know, like what's the position of women in businesses? You know, what are the responsibilities of businesses, you know, to protect women's rights in general? You know, and many of these historically have been looked at as labor issues, but they're also women's rights issues, right? You know, so there does need to be more scholarship in these areas. And one of my objectives with the book was actually to promote scholarship in newer areas, you know, in areas that weren't necessarily the classical areas. You know, I do make some mention of business and human rights and developments related to there, and economic, social, and cultural rights. And I do hope that that's an area that kind of takes off more, you know, especially with discussions of a potential treaty, although we don't know where that's going to go. Professor Steinhardt is an expert on that, so he can tell you more about that, you know. But in terms of the cover, you know, it's really interesting because for me, it was very important to have a colorful cover. You know, like I'm a very colorful person, you know, so I love color, I love red, you know, for me, colors represent hope, represent, you know, the work in international law, you know, so it's really interesting when I was discovering covers with the publisher, I was like, we need to find something that really, you know, that really projects that, you know, because it's really part of my personality. And for me, colors represent a lot of things, you know, but I think they also represent complexity, you know, that this is a very complex area. It's an area that has a lot of dimensions, you know. When you look at the cover, there's also, you'll see some colors that are traditionally associated with men, some, you know, colors that are traditionally associated with women. I wanted to break away from that, right? Because part of what we're trying to do is break from stereotypes. You know, so a lot of it was very symbolic, but I'm not the kind of person that would be happy with just like a regular, you know, cover with just one color. I just don't think it would represent my work. I think people would be like, is that really your book? You know, even like, you know, for this event, they were asking me about the colors and I was like, the red, you know, red, anything, you know, I love color in general, but I think it also represents also the way I see issues, you know, that I think, you know, these are issues that are very intricate, they're very complex, they have a lot of dimensions, they have a lot of layers, they're difficult to resolve, you know, and I wanted to represent that in the book. And I also wanted to commend you, Allison, because I think that you're doing incredible work in the area of government procurement. And I have to say, I think it's great to see, you know, thriving female scholars, you know, thriving researchers, you know, women that are really shaping, you know, their areas, you know, in the law. And it's our honor, you know, to be hosting you. And I really admire all of the work that you're doing in this area. We need more of that, you know, and you know, in the law. So it's wonderful to have you here. And I love the fact also that you're always sharing with us your experiences from South Africa, you know, as well. So thank you.
You know, Plato says that the most important political question is how do we educate the children? And so, Rosa, I look forward to a version of this book for children, so that little boys learn what women are entitled to, and women learn what they are entitled to, and those who don't fall into either gender learn what they are entitled to. It falls to me now to do only two more things. One is to invite you to an incredible spread, a reception that begins soon after this. And the second thing, of course, is to thank all of you for coming. Certainly to thank this splendid group of panelists, to thank Dean Rosa, to thank Dean Matthew. But I also, thankfully, I was just handed a list of all the people who have been central to making this event a success. These are folks who are not often acknowledged in public. I think it's important that we acknowledge them. Most of them are women. Some of them are people of color. And so I just want to call out Shondice Kolklaw, the events manager and her team, Fred Wilder and Andre Christian, Selena Davis, who does so much in this school, myriad of entertainers, Andy Foray, the greeter-in-chief, Jamie Friedman of Communications, Alicia Garvin from the Dean's Office, Maria Ataralde and team in Creative Catering, Dean Sharnaz Joshi, who does enormous work around here too, Andrew Lawrence, who's been our technician and Zoom camera and tech specialist, Dean Scott Pagel for working the room, and our photographer, Dave Scavone. So With that, join me in thanking this great panel.
Thank you so much.
All the panelists for a picture.
Oh.